I also just, yeah, okay, we're recording. So there will be time for questions at various points. I'd love to have folks on video at those moments. I will be sharing my screen, but then we can go back into more of, the gallery view. If you're new to Zoom, it might be fun to do gallery view instead of speaker view during those moments. And I'm going to do my best to mute folks for now. Okay, so there's my info going into the chat. The links aren't hyperlinks, I don't think, but you get the idea. And I also wanted to say as a caveat that I've been having a little bit of spotty internet lately. Mercury is retrograde. I wish that it wasn't like a real thing, but it actually really is. So it's not like a joke. So if I seem glitchy, I would love to just hear that in the chat. Just say, hey, you're, Kate, watch out. And what I will do at that point is I'll turn my video off, and that sometimes that helps. And fingers crossed that we're going to make it through. It seems like so far so good. Okay, so in the interest of time, I think I just want to dive in. I won't say too much more about myself. And I thank Mary Jo and the Newmarket Library for having me here today. I'm just so honored to be sharing my greatest passion and hobby with you all. So I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Okay, so there's my info again. And I just have this note at the bottom here that all of this information is presented in good faith. I am standing on the shoulders of giants, and I'll do my best to name famous thinkers in this tarot world. And I want to invite you to take notes however you please. This is being recorded and I believe will be going on YouTube. And you're also welcome to take a screenshot if you know how to do that on your device. There are a few slides here and there with quite a bit of text. And I just ask that you use these slides in good faith later. They are mine, but you can have them. Okay. So just for fun, in the chat, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, I won't read these in full, but it might be fun just to make this a little more interactive. Let's just start by tuning into some of these images. And so maybe you can say in the chat, if you'd like, where you're coming from. Your name will be attached, but you can say where you are, and then just let us know which card is kind of matching you, maybe matching your mood tonight, or maybe matching a certain phase of life that you've noticed you are in. And I want to say, as we do this exercise in the chat, I want to say that you don't have to know. Oops, we'll try to keep folks muted for now.
Oh, that must have been us.
Maybe Mary Jo can help me with that, and Carrie. Okay. What I wanted to say here is that you don't have to, quote unquote, know what the card means to connect with an image, right? That seems kind of obvious, but I think it's worth saying, because I would imagine that many of you are here tonight because you feel like, well, I don't know anything about the cards, so I want to know, I want to learn something. But I'm actually here to tell you that you already know more than you think. So as you tune into these images, I think you'll find that you're actually deeply familiar with a lot of them already. For example, the Fool, the Empress and the Emperor, the Hermit, Death, even Judgment, right? These are archetypes that you already know about. So if you want to take a moment just to tune in, I think this is a really nice way to start this program. And as you introduce yourself in the chat, I'll also encourage you to use that place as another channel. If you're just noticing something and you want to make a comment and share it with the group, we're a nice sized group tonight. So I think that that can be fun to create another channel for learning and sharing. And you can also feel free to ask questions there. And at various points, I'm going to stop and take questions. You can totally unmute yourself and ask them live, or if they've been typed, I'll take a peek at that time. So that's happening in the chat, and we'll move forward and get some information here. So a couple quotes to start us off and get the vibe for what it is that we're really talking about. So tarot cards have an association, right, with predicting the future. But I would like to posit that the best way to predict the future is actually to invent it. It's a quotation here. Likewise, I think it's better to know some of the questions than all of the answers. That's a Mark Twain quote. And so we're going to talk later about crafting good questions when you approach your tarot deck. Here's an Emerson quote I love. What lies before us, like in the future, and what lies behind us, like in the past, are small matters compared to what lies within us. So I've always felt that tarot cards are really mostly a good barometer of energy that's present here and now in the field, in the present moment. And that's the present moment is incredibly deep and incredibly rich. We have really everything we need to know about past and future here in the present. And that's what the cards are really good for. And finally, we'll return to this quote again later. This is from C.G. Jung. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So we'll return to this again and unpack this a little bit more later. So for now, let's just tune in. What you're looking at in this image is a complete tarot deck. And so when we talk about a tarot deck, we're talking about a very specific structure to a deck of cards that has 78 cards. These are the ancestors of modern playing cards. They have 4 suits. They have court cards like kings and queens. Instead of jacks, they have 2 different cards, the pages and the knights. You could see the pages in this vertical column and the knights beside them in this column. And then they have all these other special cards up here that did not survive into the playing cards, all except for this one, the Fool, who became the Joker. And so it's really as if a tarot deck is 2 separate decks of cards, what we call the major arcana and the minor arcana. So the major arcana are the 22 cards in the first 2 rows, and then the minor arcana are the 4 rows beneath. And this word arcana, it's a plural word. It means secrets or keys. So arcanum is a secret or a key. And so the idea is that every image that you see here, all 78 images, are secrets that represent spiritual principles. The card is a key into an esoteric, occult, spiritual principle. And so tonight's presentation, we're going to start with just some more background and overview. Then we're going to look more closely at the minor arcana, the minor secrets. Then we'll look at the major secrets, and then we'll kind of have put it all together, and we'll conclude our evening. And at each point, as I said, we'll stop for some questions. Okay. So what this tool is for, we talked a little bit already about this idea of predicting the future. So we have this word, divination, and I just wanted to parse it out a little bit to give you more of a sense of where I'm coming from as a tarot enthusiast. So this word divination, this is like in the Harry Potter world, this is Professor Trelawney and her classes with the big glasses. So this is the practice of seeking knowledge of the future or the unknown by supernatural means. So there is this sense of psychic or magical powers that I believe are very, very real. I don't think that those things aren't real. However, I'm also just interested in kind of another way of approaching tools like the tarot, particularly if you're reading for yourself for spiritual growth. And this is not so much about predicting the future as it is about getting in touch with your higher power. So if we look at the origin in the kind of bottom 2 images that I have on this slide, I hope they're not cut off. They might be slightly, and I apologize. We can see that etymologically, this word divination comes from Latin divinare, which means to predict, but ultimately that word comes from the Latin word divinus, divis or divis, godlike, right? And we kind of know this. We know the word divine is like godlike or holy in some way. And so I just want to leave this here for you and leave this idea that what we're really about when we approach tools like this, what we're really, or what I encourage you to be, to have top of mind is, again, cultivating a connection to your higher power and coming from that kind of really heart-centered and really open to the present moment kind of orientation, as opposed to this grasping for the future, which I think is kind of the stereotype that's associated. And I believe you don't get as much out of it when you're grasping, or I call it fishing, when you're like fishing for the future. So I'll kind of touch on these themes throughout the evening, because this is kind of my orientation towards this tool. But just shifting gears briefly, I think it's important to recognize the history of any tool that we engage with. So I have some images here of some early tarot decks. The first known tarot cards are from Renaissance Italy, mid-15th century. You can see them on the top. They're known as the Visconti Sforza deck. The images that we work with today are very influenced by this kind of seminal deck that's on the bottom here, known as the Tarot de Marseille, which is a French name, but I think it came from Italy into France. The words are in French, you'll see. These images have influenced most of the images that we work with today. And it was a game, it was a parlor game. And all we kind of know is that eventually it became associated with this other practice that we call divination. There are some theories out there that these cards have their origin further back in history into more ancient times, and there are associations with ancient Egypt. It's not totally clear if that's just kind of like apocryphal thinking on the part of kind of European occultists at the turn of the last century, or whether there is kind of like historical evidence for that. It's kind of, from what I understand, the jury's still out. So I'll just say that. Eventually, these cards proliferated throughout Europe and beyond, thanks to the Romani people. So this is an image of some traveler folks on the left. Sometimes you'll hear the word gypsy used to describe these folks, but that is becoming more and more considered a racial slur. So I just like to use the word traveler, which feels like more of an umbrella term that also includes like Western European people, like the Irish travelers. But then, of course, the Romani are a discrete ethnic group that are really associated with this tool. And I'll just say here as a caveat, I think it's important to note that a lot of our negative stereotypes about tarot have their roots ultimately in anti-Romani racism. So this idea of the fortune teller who's a charlatan, who's going to swindle you and steal your money and trick you and lie to you, this is a racist trope, basically. And so we can kind of name that, and we have a beautiful opportunity as tarot experiences this kind of heyday these days on Instagram and so forth. We can acknowledge the Romani lineage of this tool and also say very explicitly that we're not going to take these racist tropes with us. We're gonna decolonize that. So I always want to be really clear about that and acknowledge also that these are not my people ethnically. So this is a tool that I identify with, and I give my thanks and appreciation to this ethnic heritage, to the travelers. On the right on this slide is a kind of a stereotypical image, and it's a very famous image. It's so sweet. This is the artist of the images that we're going to be working with tonight. Her name was Pamela Coleman Smith, and these images, typically they're called the Rider-Waite pack. Rider was the publishing company or the publisher, and Waite was a man, an occultist, who kind of commissioned Pamela Coleman Smith to do the artwork. They kind of worked together, and so he did the writing, and like expounding on it. So he kind of historically has gotten all the credit for this deck, this very, very famous deck. And there's been quite a movement In that same vein of kind of decolonizing the tarot, there's been quite a movement to recuperate Pamela Coleman Smith's legacy and give her the credit that she deserves for her art. So that's her on the right. So those are just some caveats and pieces about the lineage of this beautiful tool. So just to give you a sense of kind of what are we talking about when we talk about tarot, we are talking about many, many hundreds of decks, if not thousands, that exist that again adhere to that 78 card structure that I touched on at the beginning, which we'll be unpacking throughout the evening. And so you can see kind of these famous Smith-RIder-Waite images on the far left. This is the Magician. This is the one that's on the package of a lot of the kind of easily available decks of these images. And then you can see some other iterations that the middle three are much more modern, and I've named them beneath. So you can kind of see like the Modern Witch. This is clearly part of an effort these days to, again, decolonize, to include melanated folks and different genders, genderqueer, and so forth. You can see in the middle, the Ostara Tarot. This is a little bit more abstract. It's a little bit less figural. It's just kind of more blown apart. The Wild Unknown is a really popular deck that uses animals. So that kind of can help us bypass racialized and kind of like gender binary type things that might be hanging us up in this really amazing time that we're living in. So that can be fun animal imagery. And then on the right, I wanted to include and just touch on briefly this kind of other branch of tarot that are much more densely symbolic images that are associated with a guy called Aleister Crowley. Similar vibe to Arthur Waite, who I mentioned before, kind of an occultist from the 20th century. And these cards are known as the Thoth or Thoth deck. That is the name of an Egyptian god. There's a lot more Egyptian symbology, like I mentioned, Kabbalistic Hebrew letters, astrological glyphs. Like you can see, the Magician is called the Magus, and there's the glyph for Mercury, the astrological body, on the left, and then there's a Hebrew letter, which is not something that I'm familiar with at all. So if this is a deck that you have at home and you are a beginner, I might just suggest that you invest in like a more, I don't want to say traditional, but a more, these Rider-Waite, the Smith-RIder-Waite images, because A, they're a little bit cleaner and less dense, and B, the teaching tools that you find online and in books are going to almost always be kind of relying heavily on this Smith-RIder-Waite tradition. And so you can kind of see, like, if you just compare this image on the left with the one on the far right, you can kind of see that if you were a beginner, it might be hard for you to connect these two images and to see that they're both the Magician. And the Thoth also has different names. It's called the Magus instead, so it's like, oh, it might feel like a lot. And I'll actually say the same thing about some of the modern decks that are kind of more abstract, or again, the animals, like the Wild Unknown is super, super popular, but the images are largely black and white. They don't, the minor arcana don't have like as much of like a picture book feeling to them. They're a little bit more sparse. That can be really hard for a beginner. So you can see, like, if the symbology is too dense, like the Thoth, or if it's too sparse, like the Wild Unknown, that might be hard for you if you're trying to learn the cards. And so kind of staying in the Smith-RIder-Waite tradition, at least to start out, is my suggestion. Okay, so the way it works, if there's folks in the crowd that are like, what are we even talking about? Because that I always have folks that are just like, I don't know how I ended up here. I don't even know what we're talking about. So what we're talking about when we're talking about doing a tarot reading, we're talking about taking the deck, shuffling it up, right? And essentially dealing cards. We call it pulling cards at random and placing them on the table and then interpreting their meaning. I believe it's easier to do that if you use what we call a spread. Sometimes people call it a lay or a spread. So if you try to read cards without a spread, you're just pulling totally randomly. That's not against the rules per se, but it's harder because then you have like words with no syntax. Like the spread is like the syntax of a sentence. So sometimes if you don't do that, you're just like, I don't really know. I don't really get it. I can't put it together, essentially. So on the left, we have the Celtic cross spread. This is kind of my own image. This is my own languaging to this spread that you're going to see in tons of books, like all over the place. Sorry, I had a little glitch there. And I have actually heard folks say to me that they've thought that you had to do a Celtic cross every time you read tarot. Like it's a card game and these are the rules. And that's not the case. You can do any type of spread you want. And again, speaking to the real newbies out there, you don't have to read 10 cards at a time. If you're just learning the cards, why force yourself to read 10? It just kind of seems silly, right? So why not start with 3? Or on the right-hand side here, I have an image, I just pulled this from the internet, of a card of the day. This is a really popular practice, not just with beginners, but with experts too, of you just pull one card in the morning. You don't force yourself necessarily to look it up in a book or even interpret it, just look at it. Then you go about your day. And then hopefully in the evening, you have some time, maybe even to take out a journal and to really just explore, well, where did this card show up for me? So that can be a really beautiful practice when you are trying to learn. And I think you'll notice a few things when you do that kind of consistent practice. I think you'll notice that you will always, always, always see the card in your day-to-day life somewhere, because that's actually how tarot works. It's a practice of making meaning and connecting things that appear to be disparate. That's synchronicity. We're going to talk about that more later. So it's not as if that's like cheating. Like it's not cheating to kind of like force it into an interpretation. That's actually what the practice is. You know, you're trying to understand, well, where, like, how does this connect to my life? So that practice of making meaning. The other thing you're going to notice if you do this daily practice is that you're going to pull a handful of cards over and over and over. It is likely that you will go years of a tarot practice and there will be some cards that you've like never pulled before. And then there's other cards that you pull like 3 times a week. And that is just evidence of how this stuff works. That's what folks say in magical communities. TSW, this stuff works. So you're always gonna find that you have like personal cards, maybe lifelong, you know, or maybe certain phases of life, or both. Okay, so that's kind of like how it works. You're shuffling, you're pulling cards, and you're placing them into a spread. And again, starting small as a beginner, 2 cards, 3 cards, I think is beautiful. 5, for me, I love 5. I think 5 is a great number. Once we get into 10, that's just a lot for a beginner. Okay. Let's see. Why do I have this here? Oh, okay. This Jung quote. Let me check the chat and make sure. Okay, good. I just want to make sure my internet's okay. Okay, good. Okay, I know why this is here. Some thoughts about like starting a tarot practice or creating your own spreads, or like, you know, the nuts and bolts, like, well, what are we doing here and how do we do it? I want to kind of highlight the difference between like fate and destiny. And again, this Carl Jung quote that's so like pivotal to me. So until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Essentially, what tarot is for is for making unconscious material become conscious to you. The better you get at doing that for yourself and for others, the clearer this distinction between fate and destiny will become for you, and you will become empowered. You will empower yourself to be the magician in your own life and create your own destiny, make your own magic, instead of wringing your hands and saying, woe is me, I can't believe this, another bad thing happened to pitiful old me. And I say that with loving sarcasm, because I myself have been in that position. When I first started playing with tarot cards when I was like 15, I totally thought this was about predicting the future and figuring out my fate. And, as a young femme, it was like about when am I gonna like get a boyfriend, or so many people come to tarot looking for love and that, or money. And so I say that with great love and compassion because we've all been there. But really this is about deeper psychological growth and development, which we encounter through love. We encounter it through our work and our finances and these circumstantial pieces of our lives. Yeah, but there's also this kind of spiritual soul level of things that tarot is really, again, trying to, I always imagine that it's bringing it up, that the unconscious, it's called the subconscious, right? It's beneath. So there's this well of information beneath that the cards are meant to bring up to be examined by us. And hopefully, as I said, with the result of empowerment and not disempowerment. So in that light, on this slide, I just have some examples. I won't read them all, but you can kind of take a peek at what I'm getting at here when we talk about disempowering versus empowering questions. So again, instead of asking your cards what's going to happen in the future, it might be more interesting and fruitful for you to ask something like, what card can be a guide for me right now? It's not that it's against the rules to ask about the future. I do it all the time for clients, 15-minute reading, 3 cards, past, present, future. It's fine to approach in that way, but I always tell folks, especially when folks come to me with a question that is very future oriented, like, will this work out or won't this work out? I will have to kind of disabuse folks, at least of my approach to the cards, and I'll explain it like this. It's not as if there's a future that's already written that's coming at you like a Mack truck. That's not how this universe works, as far as I understand. It's more like there's possible timelines, and we're trying to understand the tools and resources that we have in the present moment so that we can best magnetize the timeline that is in our highest and best interest, which isn't always the easiest one. In fact, it's rarely the easiest one, but I think you get the idea. So I'll just pause here real quickly. I'll take a sip and look at my notes as well. Okay. Couple more slides and then we can pause for some questions. Just a note about scary cards, kind of on this train of thinking about kind of myth busting. We have some really deep-seated associations with tarot.
Question.
Oh, if you don't mind just waiting, I've got 2 more slides and then we'll pause for questions. That would be great. So I'll loop back to you. Okay. Yeah, so come on, train of thought. Oh, we have associations with tarot, especially if we were raised, in a religious background. We have associations with tarot as just being really like scary and dark. Our occult just means hidden, but we associate the occult with like evil or something. So I just wanted to just tune in and just acknowledge that and lay some scary cards out on this slide and just acknowledge that what we're really talking about when we're looking at these kind of more scary images, whenever you see kind of death and destruction, we're really talking about the death of some ego version of self that no longer serves you, that isn't fully authentic or in alignment, with your path or your purpose or your destiny. So that is what is dying when we pull the death card. That doesn't mean that there might not actually be a true death, like a loss of a loved one. Look at the Five of Cups, for example, this image here. This card will often come up when someone is in a process of grief. So there, this can be literal. And yet we want to bring this deeper, more kind of, again, esoteric or soul level analysis to these cards, so that we can kind of break out of these like stereotypes that we have, basically, like, that you see in the movies sometimes. It's like the death card. Ooh, like, oh no, someone's gonna die today. Like, it's just, I'm laughing about it because it's just, I think it's silly. So you're here, so that. Last piece here, before we pause, is just a note about reversals. So this is a big question that a lot of beginners have. Do I have to read reversals? What if I'm shuffling and the cards get flipped and some are upside down and some are right side up? Do they mean something different? Lots of books that you purchase, even like the booklet that came with a deck, they kind of, the way it's set up, like, almost implies that you have to memorize 2 meanings for every card. So 78 times 2, whatever that is, mental math. And that's not really the case. We're going to talk about a number of ways to kind of avoid having to memorize discrete meanings for each card. When we talk about the minors, we'll talk about some frameworks we can use. And also just end this piece by just letting you know that with reversals, everything contains its opposite. So Five of Wands, this is, appears to be an image of struggle and strife. Struggle also contains the idea of like making peace, right? Struggle contains peace, and peace contains struggle on some level. So you don't necessarily have to read reversals. There are readers, beginners, and experts who just don't bother really, and kind of just tune into their own intuition to interpret each card. I like to read reversals because I feel like they just add nuance. So when a card comes up reversed, I know that there's something, I call it wonky or distorted, that there's something, the core essential energy of the card. And then I wrote some things at the bottom here. Maybe it's blocked, maybe it's delayed, it's distorted, or it's like it's being abused somehow, like it's a shadow projection type of thing. It's untapped or potential energy. It hasn't happened yet. Or the opposite. It's already happened and it's ending. It's shifting, it's changing. So you can't, in my mind at least, you can't really know what any card means, but particularly a reversed card. You really can't know until it's within the context of the spread. So it's really not about memorizing a meaning. It's more about tuning in to a card within the context of a reading, whether for yourself or for another person. Okay. So we'll pause there and we'll take questions. So if the disembodied voice wants to unmute themselves and ask their question, we'll start there.
So my question is,
yeah,
why does one of the cards from 709 have IX instead of XII?
Ooh, double I. Oh, where did you see that? Right here?
No, before that.
Before that?
Hanged Man, I think.
Hanged Man. Where was that? Did I have an image of the Hanged Man?
But before that, it was before that.
Oh, like the main. Oh, okay, like on this slide.
I think.
Yeah, the Hanged Man is 12, so it's XII.
Okay, look, how about the slide after that? Well, no, before that, I think.
Justice. I know they're really teensy tiny.
I thought
Um,
I saw a double IX.
double IX. I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so because look, there's like 8 is V triple I. I do so like 8 is I'm putting it in the chat. I do think sometimes like that can mean 8, but that's not how these are written. But this I like this little piece because I always just want to say that Roman numerals are hard, I think. Like I felt this when I was an English teacher. Like some books we read would have Roman numerals and kids would be like, oh. So, if anybody out there is like, what, that is a piece of it, especially with the minor arcana, right? Look, all you have is a Roman numeral and then
Yes.
yeah,
Yes, I find Roman numerals cool, I'm
yeah,
actually able to read them pretty well, and I'm a
good.
mathematician even.
There you go. Yeah, it's a different language. Like it's a different language, but if you dig
True.
it, then that's like half the battle. Cool. Okay. Yeah, so Hanged Man, I think, yeah, is 12. XII. Beautiful. All right, let's see what else we might have for questions before we dive into. Yeah, okay, there's the question. Boo doo 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 doo. Okay, here's another question. How is the tower a scary card? Yeah, well, it looks scary for the people that were in the tower because they're falling out. But on that same token of like, is it really scary or is it exciting? It's like, yeah, the tower is scary if you're hanging on to something from your past that you don't, if it's time to change, but you're reluctant to change. If the tower is some structure in your life that doesn't work anymore and you're hanging on to it desperately, like then of course it's scary. But if you're kind of sensing that it's time to change, then maybe the tower card is quite exciting indeed. Oop, too far. Okay. Da, 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 da. Yes. Okay. Here's a question from Sophia. This is a great question. So my deck has stones, spirals, scrolls, and mirrors. So this is an example of a creation from the artist or artists that made your deck that is like deviating from the traditional. So I don't happen to know what the equivalent is, but I would assume if this deck is any good at all, they somewhere in their guidebook, they should make it clear. And maybe they won't say, um, okay, like stones are probably pentacles, I'm guessing. But even if they don't say pentacles, they're probably going to say the earth element. And that's where we're going next in our PowerPoint. So that may elucidate some of this for you, Sophia. Stones, I would guess, are earth. Scrolls, I would guess, are air. Mirrors and spirals, I'm thinking mirrors are probably water and spirals are fire. That's my guess, but I'm not familiar with that deck per se. Okay. But that's a great example of like maybe as a beginner that can be tough. Or maybe it's not, maybe it's fine. Okay. So in the interest of time, we are gonna do a hard stop at 8. So I'm gonna just keep on trucking. And if you have more questions, go ahead and type them in the chat as we go. All right, so now we're starting to drill down into these two kind of complementary decks, the minor and the major arcana. So we're going to start with the minors. So this is what I was just speaking about to Sophia's question, the 4 suits. So again, these are the ancestors of playing cards. Wands became clubs, cups became hearts, swords became spades, pentacles became diamonds. And as I mentioned, they all have an elemental association. So this is a slide. This might be a good one to screenshot. Excuse me, if you're taking little screenshots as we go. Lots of information here. I'm not going to read it word for word, but you can kind of start to get the bird's eye view of the associations with each of these elemental energies. And I will say that this probably looks very familiar to you because these four elements are the foundation of most Western occult systems and traditions and thinking. It's really like a cosmology. So, in other words, it's the idea that the universe is actually made out of these four elements, including us and our body vessels, but also everything around us. These four elements, and then the fifth element, which is spirit or ether. And so they have this, a similar, not identical, but a similar cosmology in the Eastern world. And like, if you're familiar with Chinese medicine, and in fact, or Chinese tradition, in fact, I've used the Chinese words here, yin and yang, right? So we're talking about yin and yang. And just as they believe in that tradition, it's like everything's made out of those energies. And we can really start to tune into each arcanum, each secret or key, as an energetic principle. Okay, the images, these classic images that we're working with, they're helpful. We like them. They help us recognize the card and name the card, but we don't actually need the images to understand these energies. In fact, if you get good enough, like reading tarot, you can actually read tarot with a deck of playing cards. You won't have the major arcana, you won't have pages and knights, you'll only have jacks, but you can kind of get the idea, you can get the gist, you can get something out of it, if you kind of take as your premise that these suits represent elements, and the numbers, we'll get into those in the next slide. Okay, so again, I'm not going to read this word for word, but you're just kind of taking it all in, and taking notes accordingly for future reference. Okay. Okay. So on the next slide, take a screenshot of this one as well. This shows us all the minor arcana numbers and the court cards. So the numbers we call pips, and then the court cards. And you'll see in this image that I've pulled cards from all four suits just to kind of give you, a wide range. And you can see that I've included some typical keywords that are associated with the number. So between this slide and the last slide, you should have roughly everything you need to read the minors. Yeah, of course, these keywords are extremely limited. Like, this is not, these are single words to very complex ideas, and that, but this is something to hang our hat on. So again, I won't read all of these, but I will just point out, if you look at the pips and you look from number 1, the ace, it says potential. And then we look at the end, number 10, I wrote end/begin. So you can kind of get the sense that there's like a cyclical nature here. And so, yeah, and then you just fill in from within, within that cycle. One kind of conceptual piece that I'll share here that might be idiosyncratic, I don't know, but I want to share it. The way I think of it is that the suit tells me the element, and the number tells me the frequency or vibration. So there's a certain vibration to 1, there's a vibration to 2 and 3, and so on. And it's as if that element, let's say, let's look at the 2 of Pentacles that I've displayed here. So we're talking about earth energy with pentacles. We're talking about what is material in our lives, our work, our money, our shelter, our body, our exercise, nourishment, sleep hygiene. These are earth concerns. And then the vibration of 2, to me, is it's like a buzzing, it's like a seed that's about to crack open. It can feel really wobbly and chaotic. It can feel really like stagnant and frustrated, like it needs to become something more. And often the circumstance that's reflected is about a choice. I wrote the word duality, but you'll also see the word choice a lot with 2. It's like you have a choice. to expand, and how are you going to do that? You're like weighing options type of thing. So that was just one example. I won't go through all of them, but you can kind of see I did a lot of like hand movements if you're looking at my video. So it's this, again, this idea of vibration or frequency. And pardon the train going by here in Dover. At the bottom of this slide, I want to touch on the court cards. These can be real toughies for beginners. Simply, I think, because they all kind of look alike. It's like you pull a court card. Well, first of all, they're confusing because they typically have a name at the bottom, but they're not major arcana. So you see one and you think like, oh, it's a major card, but no, it's a minor card, but it has a fancy title. So that piece is weird. And then they're like figures, the kings are all seated on a throne, as are the queens. The knights are all on a horse and the pages are all standing. So it's just like, well, what am I looking at? Kind of, it can be really confusing. So I offer this framework for you. If it resonates, not every tarot reader necessarily like really relies on this framework that I'm about to share, but I like it. And it's this idea that the court cards are double elemented. So there's the suit, which we've established. Okay, and then there's the face value of the card, and those guys have elements as well. So the pages are earth, the knights are fire, the queens are water, and the kings are air. And you can see at the bottom that I've pulled from the deck the double. So Page of Pentacles, earth of earth, Knight of Wands, fire of fire, Queen of Cups, water of water, King of Swords, air of air. And the idea is that the page is the one who is exploring his element. He's getting his hands dirty. He's figuring out, how does it work? There's a down to earth nature to the page. A page is a messenger. That's what the word page means. So that you'll see that sometimes in guidebooks as well. The knights are fire because they use their element. They go on a quest. They externalize into the world. It's very yang. It's like, here we go. The queens are water because they internalize and they embody their element. They just kind of like exist as that element in a very kind of sensitive way, intuitive way. Those are water words. The kings are the ones that are true masters of their element. Air energy is mental energy. So there's kind of a rarefied or intellectualized feeling to the kings. So that information that may feel a little bit kind of like hard to grasp, that might feel like you want to just set that aside for a later time. But for some of you that have kind of been trying to learn, but you haven't quite cracked the code, I'm hoping that was really helpful for you with the court cards specifically. And the last piece I'll say, and then we're going to pause again real briefly. The last piece I'll say is that traditionally the court cards were seen to they were in a divinatory fortune telling setting. They were thought to represent other people, like people outside of the client, or we say the querent, the person asking the question. So like a king was an older man, a knight was like an eligible bachelor, basically. And you can read them that way. Many guidebooks will direct you to read them that way, but personally, I'm more interested in interpreting these court cards as parts of self that can really engage with and embody the elemental energies. So the kings, for example, are the part of you that are masters, that you already know what you're doing. Stop doubting yourself. That's what the king says. Stop doubting yourself. You know what to do, that kingly part of you. So I'll leave that there in the interest of time, and we'll just pause here. And that was, very, very quick. So I just want to see if there are any questions bubbling up about the minor cards specifically. And you can go ahead and unmute yourself, or if you're feeling shy, you can type it in the chat. Beautiful. So, in these last 10 minutes here, we're just going to start to scratch the surface on the major arcana. We won't have a lot of time to go into discrete meanings for all 22, but we'll just kind of talk about some high level concepts and see kind of what sticks. So here's the image. We saw this at the beginning. We've got 22 major arcana numbered 0 through 21. So the Fool is number 0. And you can see I've displayed it here in its own row. It's often kind of seen as being throughout the whole story, 1 through 21, that the Fool is actually like in the background of everything. He's the alpha omega, he's the beginning and the end. He's the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail. He's just like everywhere. So I've always loved that about the Fool. I think that's very intriguing. Okay. So what we're seeing, okay. What we're seeing when we see these images, specifically the majors, are archetypes, right? I've used that word already, but just to be clear, I'm really using it in the Jungian sense that you can see right here. So Jung said that an archetype is a primitive mental image inherited from the earliest human ancestors and supposed to be present in the collective unconscious. So that quote we had from him earlier, when we say that tarot makes the unconscious conscious, we're actually talking about a couple different levels of unconscious. We're talking about your own psyche and potentially shadowy material that is repressed, usually for very good reason, right? But there are times in our psychological development when it would behoove us to look at repressed material, right? And that happens. The tarot deck will show you things that you don't want to see. That's kind of its reputation. Okay. So there's that level. And then there's this other thing that Jung talked about, which I imagine is even deeper than that he called the collective unconscious, which is where these kind of images live that honestly, nobody has to really tell you about it. So this is kind of where I started with like, pick a card, any card. I don't have to tell you what the magician means. I don't have to tell you what the hermit means. You already know. You, in fact, I think, and Jung would say that you were born knowing. Then you had to acquire language. We're all sitting here speaking English, calling it the hermit. But the magician, other archetypes can hang on top of it too. Like the magician is also the shaman. The Fool is the joker, the court jester. What else? The Hierophant is the oracle. Right, the Wheel of Fortune is chance. All of these, we already know what these things are. You don't have to be educated in any way on some level, although there is like a structure to tarot. It's not like willy-nilly, there's a structure to be learned. What Jung said in his theory is that he coined the word synchronicity as we know it today. And I mentioned this earlier, where we're making connections between two things that seem disconnected. So synchronicity is the simultaneous occurrence of events which appear significantly related, but have no discernible causal connection. So that is essentially what you're doing when you read tarot. It's the whole premise of the tool. And that's this is like the mechanism by which the unconscious is made conscious, because you see an image and it reminds you of something. When you're reading for yourself, when you're reading for another person, you see the image and if with any luck, it's like opens up your intuitive channel and your psychic gifts are kind of activated by the imagery, right? Jung said that this phenomenon of making these connections, synchronicity, occurs in the presence of an activated archetype, i.e., when archetypal energy is in your psychic field, when it's present as an energy. So this is kind of heady. This is kind of like woo-woo, But I think it's worth pointing out because it's kind of like, as you start to get to know your tarot deck and you start to encounter the major arcana in reading, you're really um, invited to find that archetype everywhere you go and start looking for it, because the universe is trying to speak to you through that archetype. Your higher power is trying to speak to you. And so the more that you can see it in your field, and this can be literal, like you're walking by a bulletin board and you see a poster with this figure that is dressed like a magician. And you're like, oh my God, I just pulled the magician card. This is like how it works. This is how we activate these things consciously in our lives. And the last piece I'll leave you with as we start to wrap up is that what the universe is trying to tell you about, what your higher power is trying to kind of knock on the door and tell you about when you're consciously working with the tarot as a tool. We can sum this up by understanding the major arcana through this framework of what we call the fool's journey. Okay, so we can break these cards into these 3 groups, 3 lines in order from 1 to 21, and we can start to see a storyline unfolding that we can call life, death, and rebirth. So in that first line, when we pull these cards, we're being shown arcana, keys, secrets about ego development. When we pull cards from the second line, this is about ego death, the death of a lower self, like a self with a little s. And then when we pull cards in the third line, we're being shown secrets or keys that have to do with rebirth, the birth of a self with a capital S, the birth of some state of higher consciousness. And so it's not that life happens in a really linear way. It really doesn't. Life is very messy, but this is a really useful framework for starting to kind of like unpack the individual meanings of the cards. Just like the minor arcana have 4 suits, we can kind of put the major arcana into these 3 buckets, life, death, and rebirth, and just tune into them as a group. And then you'll have to use your guidebooks and use websites from there. Okay, so it is just about 8 o'clock. I recognize that I've sped through, and of course I didn't get to everything I wanted to get to, but I did my best. So I'm going to stop the share, and I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So if anybody has a hard stop right at 8 o'clock and needs to leave the Zoom room, I won't be at all offended. But I'm happy to stay. I don't know, that's up to the library, but I'm happy to stay if there are additional questions. And again, I think there might be, because I feel there's a ton more to talk about. So let's see if anybody has a question out there.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
And that is, as a real beginner, and this is just a very brief introduction, what would the next step be?
Yeah, beautiful question. Well, first, let me ask Mary Jo or Carrie a question. Would it be possible to send an email to those folks who registered tonight?
Yeah, absolutely. If you send me, yes, send it to my work email, and we can shoot it out to all the registrants.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So, Regina, I will send through the library, I'll send my resources list of my favorite kind of longer form books. So when you buy a deck, there's a little booklet that comes with it, but then people have also written entire texts. And if you're a podcast person, there's a number of podcasts as well. So those would be good resources if you're more of like the studying type. But from here, just like what you can do tonight, like hands-on, I would say that the card of the day practice, I think, is the best place to start as a beginner. And again, don't force yourself to do big, elaborate spreads. Start really small, pulling one card, looking in your booklet, maybe tapping into an online resources like tarot.com or Biddy Tarot. These are like kind of the things that will come up first on Google.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
In terms of the life, death, and rebirth thing, I was wondering, some of them I can see exactly how they would fit into those categories, and some not, like temperance.
Mm.
What part of that fits into death?
Yeah.
It's at the very end, so I'm interested to see how that happens.
Yeah. What I will say, I want to just type 2 names of famous tarotists in the chat who have, I think, both spoken on this idea of the Fool's Journey. Mary K. Greer and Rachel Pollack. You may have heard of them before. So even just going on Google and typing in the Fool's Journey, Mary K. Greer, and just see, maybe, I don't know if there is online kind of like a list of all the cards. Mary K. Greer has written that in her books. Like, it's a story. It's like the fool sets out on his journey. So, and that can be fun to even write your own story. But yeah, let me just real quick with temperance. So temperance, if I can share my screen again real quick, you'll see that temperance is actually the last card on that line. And so in a certain sense, we're already kind of moving towards rebirth, aren't we? But yeah, I would say that it's kind of like death is the big transformation point where some version of you has died. And then the way I see it, it's like temperance is life after death. And it's like, it's like the angel in temperance takes you by the hand so that you can face the next line of rebirth, which starts with the devil and the tower. So it's not like the rebirth is like a cakewalk. There's some really nitty gritty shadow material that you encounter. It's almost like a birth canal type of, it's like, it's not easy. And then it gets a little bit lighter, so those are just some quick thoughts. But yeah, I love that question, because the more that we can tell a story like this, I think the more these cards start to just become real to us. And that's really what the Fool's Journey is about.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Here's a comment from Sophia. Yeah, the Chrysalis Tarot deck. Yeah, cool. Awesome. Thank you for that suggestion, Sophia. The art is amazing and integrates different mythologies and nature artwork. Yeah, there's just so many beautiful decks out there. And I particularly like the ones that, bring in other gods and goddesses, or, just from like non-Western cultures. And because this archetypal thing, this Jungian thing, it's like it's energy that exists somehow before like paradigms, so there's a reason that all cultures have a god of death, or a goddess of love, or it's like they're all kind of the same, no matter if we call them Venus or whatever. Beautiful.